I'm just going to give you a couple tidbits of information before we get started. One is league members will be monitoring questions for Secretary Simon when he's done speaking, and then they will pass them on to me during the last part of the hour. And so if you have questions, you can put them in the Zoom chat box and they'll get them to me. We also have some questions that were submitted ahead of time. And so we can start with those and then we'll add yours in, and we'll try to get as many questions answered as always, like the league does, as many as possible so that your questions are answered. This is a Zoom meeting and it's to be recorded, and it is being recorded. I can see the little red dot, so just know that. And we will be posting this on the League's website, the Rochester League's website and Facebook page for people that you might want to share this with after. You have been admitted with your camera off and your microphones muted. Attendees will remain muted throughout the presentation, but again, we'll communicate through the chat. So without further ado, I am very excited and delighted to have Minnesota's Secretary of State, Steve Simon, with us today as our guest speaker. Steve was elected to the Secretary of State position in 2014 and took office in 2015, and it's hard to believe it's been that long. Steve is our 22nd Secretary of State, and this is an office that affects every single one of our 87 counties. And they help every single Minnesotan set up and run their businesses. They protect victims of domestic violence and people who fear for their safety. The Secretary of State's office also, and is probably best known for, ensuring that our election system is fair, open, impartial, and secure. So we've asked him here tonight to share his insights about the 2020 election, talk about what's needed to protect our democracy moving into the years ahead. And I will just add that Secretary Simon was my seatmate on the floor of the House. We sat next to each other for a number of years. And I know him to be just an absolutely wonderful human being, along with a wonderful Secretary of State and a great guy. I had fun all those years. He's very serious about the work he does, and he takes his job as Secretary of State even more seriously, or probably as seriously, maybe even more seriously, because a fair election is key to a proper democracy. So Secretary of State Simon, thank you for being here, and we're going to give you the floor.
Well, thank you, Mayor Norton. It's great to be with all of you, and it's an honor to be with all of you, frankly. When Kim Norton calls, I say yes, and everyone does, most everyone does. Those of us who know her, and I do from legislative service, know her to be a straight shooter, know her to be smart and honest and ethical, and also just an all-around great person. So I was thrilled when she was elected mayor because, as she said, I sat next to her, literally next to her on the House floor for a number of years. I can't remember whether it was 2 or 4, but at least one term, we were right next to each other on the House floor. And I really learned a lot from her as well. And so it's an honor to be here with her and with all of you. I want to thank you in particular at the Rochester League. I want to thank the League of Women Voters generally. It's not lost on me the historical role that this organization has played, not just in Minnesota, but nationwide. It's not lost on me that we somewhat recently celebrated the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. And it's really hard to overstate the importance of what that event did and the role of the League of Women Voters in it. As you know, it was a formative event in the history of the organization. My grandmother, long since deceased, was born in 1902. And when I was growing up, I remember vividly, I even remember the place where I was standing in our house when we had the discussion. I was in probably junior high or something like that. And I discussed with her women's suffrage. We must have studied it in school that day, but I remember exactly where I was standing and talking to her about it. And back then, of course, the voting age was 21, not 18. So in 2020, when she was 18, or excuse me, 1920, when she was 18, she could not vote, but she could vote starting in the presidential election of 2024. And I remember her specifically saying how well she remembered it, again, born in 1902. And she said something interesting. Not only was it empowering for her to be able to vote as a young woman at that point, 22, but how empowering it was for her own mother, her immigrant mother who had fled Eastern Europe, fled Lithuania a few decades earlier, not only couldn't vote in her home country, couldn't vote in her adopted home country either until middle age or older. and how empowering it was for her mother, my great-grandmother, who I never met as well. All that is to say, thank you to the League for a wonderful legacy and for carrying on that legacy today. I really appreciate it. And it's been a delight to have the League for the last several years since I've been in this job be a fantastic ally and a real dependable source of information, testifiers, advocacy when it comes to the legislative work as well. So here we are, a few days before an inauguration of a new president, and only a couple months or so after what was, I think we can all agree, one of the most momentous presidential elections in the history of the country. And as Kim, as Mayor Norton said at the outset, we do a lot of things in our office. We do a lot with the business community in terms of business registrations and other business services, vitally important. We run a program called the Safe at Home program, which protects victims of domestic violence and stalking and others who fear for their safety. But there's no question about it that the duty or the basket of duties that most people associate with us and are most interested in has to do with elections. And we are the chief elections officer for the state of Minnesota. So I like to say that I'm in the democracy business, and what a time to be in the democracy business. I'm sure you will agree. Some of the nuts and bolts of elections administration, which in previous years, didn't get much attention, really have over the last several years. I would say in 2020 and even in 2016 as well. And I've had a front row seat to a lot of that, particularly in Minnesota, but to some extent nationwide as well. So the mission of putting on an election in 2020 was, to put it mildly, very challenging. And let me just say a word about elections, generally speaking. Elections are intense. They're supposed to be intense. They're designed to be intense, and that's not a bad thing. Sometimes it can make people feel anxious or nervous, but there's supposed to be a clash of ideals and approaches and records and aspirations. There's nothing wrong with that intensity. And they're even more intense at the presidential level for all the obvious reasons, because the stakes are really high. And you add and layer onto that the fact that we were doing this during a once-in-a-century pandemic, and you get real serious intensity. And that's what I felt all year long during 2020. So I want to talk a little bit about what that was like and what I think the road ahead is going to be. And then I really do want to get to a discussion. I don't just want to talk at you. I'd love to have a discussion, not just your questions, but your answers or your input or your advice or your insights as well. But let me tell you how the world looks from where I sit when it comes to democracy and elections, since, as I say, I like to say I'm in the democracy business. First, let me talk about the pandemic, the obvious thing. As you know, it really hit hard in March. By mid to late March, that's when schools were closing, businesses were shuttering, the orders were flying from the governor's office, from the president and others. And that's when society really changed, not just in Minnesota, not just in the United States, but globally. Now, you may remember back to March, it seems like a lifetime ago, but last March 3rd was our presidential nominating primary. Some of you may have voted in that contest and certainly remember that time. A vigorous presidential contest, certainly within the Democratic Party. And I have said 100 times since then, thank goodness that our presidential primary was March 3rd and not March 10th or 17th or 24th. We were right on the cusp. March 3rd, things went well. Had it been just a couple weeks later, we might have experienced some of the difficulties, if not chaos, that other states experienced. So it didn't take us long from the dawn of COVID to realize that this was going to be a different kind of election. Just from an administrative standpoint, we knew we were going to have to do things differently. And part of the reason we came to that realization has to do with the math problem. You didn't think there would be any math this close to dinner. I promise you there won't be a lot of math, but here's a little math to tide you over. And the math is pretty simple, fortunately. Here's how we looked at it in late March or early April. We've got about 3,000 polling places in Minnesota. We were expecting, we thought, about 3 million voters in Minnesota. You can do that math pretty easily and nicely. That comes out to about 1,000 people per polling place. That's a lot of people. And we knew from the standpoint of public health alone, not to mention other considerations, that we were going to have to try to get that number down. We're talking about 1,000 people and their droplets circulating, sometimes in relatively close quarters, in a 13-hour period. Election day, of course, the balloting is 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. We had to reduce that risk. And it's not just us saying that. It's not just our hunch. It's medical and scientific professionals at the federal level. If you went to the national websites, the CDC website, it's probably still up there now. If you go there right now during this call, you'll see what they say about polling places. Not that they were inherently more dangerous than other places where similar numbers of people congregated, but they were saying, like other places where other similar number of people congregated, use your head, use some common sense. not just social distancing, but if there is an alternative, seek it out. And that's what we knew that we had to do. You look at the polls at the time. This spring, a poll was taken, a national poll by the Pew, folks at Pew Research, very highly respected, nonpartisan to a fault. They did a national poll, which really caught us, made us take notice. And the poll said that 66% of voters, this was April or May, 66% of voters nationwide said that they would feel uncomfortable. That was the exact word that was polled, uncomfortable going to a polling place in 2020 to vote. I think we knew at the time we had to listen. Voters were trying to tell us something. And what they were trying to tell us nationwide and in Minnesota was they wanted alternative methods and means of voting. And so we knew that that would have to be a cornerstone of our strategy. And so what we did is we emphasized what we called voting from home. It's really something we've had on the books for a long time, something that then Representative Norton voted for too, which was no excuses absentee voting. That's a clunky phrase, but we preferred to rebrand it as voting from home, meaning you can go to a website or go in person, I suppose, and order a ballot to come to you where you live rather than having to go either to a government office to vote absentee early or rather than having to go to a polling place. And this is, again, nothing new. Then Representative Norton and I, we may have been sitting next to each other at that point, we voted for that back in 2013, which is to say you don't need an excuse or an explanation anymore. You can just do it because you want to do it. You no longer have to certify that you're going to be out of town or that you're sick or that you're disabled. You can do it because you want to do it. And that has worked out very well in Minnesota. So this was nothing new. No new law had to be passed. And in fact, we were part of a trend and are now part of a trend of increasing reliance on that method of voting. In 2018, not 2020, but in 2018, the last election before this presidential election, 24% of Minnesotans, so just shy of a quarter, 24% of Minnesotans had already voted that way. They had voted either from home or otherwise voted absentee. So it was already a pretty steady trajectory of people embracing that method of voting. So we called it vote from home. And just to give you an idea about how ready Minnesotans were by the spring and early summer to embrace this method of voting, let me give you some more numbers. I promise I won't bury you with numbers, but I think you're going to find this one interesting. Usually we open up the website portal in mid-May. That's when we open it up. That's when everyone, the gates are thrust open, so to speak, the cyber gates, you might say, and anyone who wants to vote that way can go online starting in mid-May to order their ballot to come to them at home. So let me just give you a couple numbers to show you just how intense the demand was for this. In 2016, so 4 years ago, now 5, I guess, but 4 years ago from the presidential election, in 2016, in the first week that we opened that portal, you know how many people statewide, the entire state of Minnesota, millions of people, statewide in 2016, how many people after 1 week said, sign me up, I'm going to the website, please send me my ballot at home? 88 people. 2 years later, in 2018, that number was 173 people during that first week. You know what it was in the first week in 2020? 36,880. Let me give you those numbers again. 88, 173, and 36,880. Again, voters are trying to tell us something. They're saying that during a once-in-a-century pandemic, this, for many people, was an option that they felt safe using. So we really harnessed that and we used it and we put resources and energy and time behind reminding people of that option for their voting. So the numbers don't lie. When you look at how voters embrace this, we had a really good dress rehearsal during the August primary. The August primary is always a nice dress rehearsal or dry run for the general election. And there, about 60% in the primary of voters who voted in that primary voted that way. They voted from home or early absentee. Only 40% or so actually showed up the traditional way on the traditional Tuesday at a designated polling place. So we knew we were onto something and we knew we were making a contribution. And let me just say, maybe it seems obvious maybe, but I think it bears repeating. In the past, and as recently as 2018, when we had about 24% vote that way, the allure or the appeal of voting that way was the obvious one. It was comfort and convenience, right? There was no pandemic, but people were found appealing the idea of voting from their living room, voting from their couch, voting while they're folding laundry or eating a meal or watching TV or whatever. And this time, it wasn't just comfort and convenience. There were two other things going on. One was just minimizing personal risk, the obvious one. And the other was, and we heard this time and time again, this sort of public service aspect, this idea that everyone who votes from home in 2020 is not only protecting themselves, but is making the polling place just a little bit safer for everyone who chose that equally legitimate option. We weren't looking to shame people who go to the polling place. That's absolutely equally as legitimate and equally as lawful, obviously, as voting from home. But every person that stayed home meant now instead of 1,000 per polling place, now because of you, it's 999, and because of me, it's 998, and because of your neighbor, it's 997. You can get that number down. So it's a twofer. You're doing yourself a favor, minimizing your own risk, and you're doing a favor for those who, for whatever reason, they don't owe anyone an explanation, want to show up to the polling place. So, so that was really, I think, really important. And the results don't lie. We had record turnout. For the third election in a row, we were the #1 state in the country. When I came in, we were #6 in the country, not shabby, not bad at all. If you're grading on a curve, 6 out of 50, that's a really good grade, right? But we wanted to get back to #1. We did in 2016. We repeated in 2018. And this year, the sweetest of all, during a once-in-a-century pandemic, we got back on top of the hill for the third time in a row. And not only that, not only were we #1 again in the country, at just shy, achingly shy of 80%, 79.95%. I guess if you round up, it's 80. Technically 79.95%. But we were the highest, even in nation-leading Minnesota, we were the highest in Minnesota since 1956, the highest voter turnout. I don't know what it was about that Eisenhower-Stevenson rematch that fired people up, but for some reason, 1956 was a big one, and this was the biggest since then. And then if you look at the percentage, once again, just like the primary, 58% of Minnesotans in the general election, 58% voted from home or early by absentee. Only 42% voted the old-fashioned way, or I should say the typical way, and the more regular way of voting in a designated polling place on election day, the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. And that says something. That says that Minnesotans and really people all over the country were really craving that. But let me talk about another kind of success in the election that goes beyond turnout, beyond public safety, and all the rest. Sometimes, as you all know from your own lives, it's the absence of something rather than the presence of something which accounts for success. And I want to talk about all the bullets that we dodged and the things that could have gone wrong this election that did not go wrong. And they didn't go wrong out of luck or coincidence. They didn't go wrong because people all over the state, not just our office, but people at the county and city level worked really damn hard from spring and summer and fall onward to make sure that these things didn't happen. So for example, some of you remember way back in late March and early April, some of the scenes you may have seen during the presidential primary season from Wisconsin, from Georgia, from other states with unconscionably long lines, people confused and shut out, and in some cases, literally or figuratively shut out of the polling place. And a lot of the reason that happened was a chronic last-minute shortage of poll workers, of election judges. In Minnesota, it takes 30,000 people to run an election. That's a small army. I'm sure some of you on this call have been election judges in the past. It wouldn't surprise me. A lot of league members have been at least once. And you know that's an important job and it's a hard job, made even harder by the fact that you have to recruit people during a once-in-a-century pandemic and ask them to station themselves for at least 13 hours in often closed quarters. I vote in a church basement a few blocks from my house. It's a beautiful building, wonderful people, but there's not a lot of room down there, low ceiling and so forth. And we knew that that was going to be a problem based on other states where they had real upheaval and confusion, if not chaos, at the polling place. So we worked that problem really, really hard with our partners at the city and county to make sure that we had enough people, and we did for both the primary and the general. We were also worried about just hygiene, health, and cleanliness in the polling place. So our office paid for and distributed to all 3,000 polling places PPE and supplies, hand sanitizer, pumps, wipes, single-use pens in many cases, and the like. And then we had protocols in place that we wrote with the Department of Health, with guidance from the CDC that governed everything from social distancing to the use of those pens to the automatic wipe down of the stations, the voting stations after the use by voters. So that's another thing. And then a third thing I would say, another example of the absence of something rather than the presence of something, was the real threat and the real prospect in the days and weeks leading up to the election of conflict or even violence at the polling place. You may recall that in early October, there was a story, a national story about Minnesota. The Washington Post picked it up, saying that there had been a Tennessee employment agency that had posted an ad seeking members of the military to come to Minnesota to help law enforcement guard polling places in Minneapolis and other places. That set off a lot of alarm bells in the public safety sphere in Minnesota. They neither asked for nor needed any of this help from outside forces, maybe vigilante types who thought they were helping and would really end up roiling the waters more than anything else. It's not legal under Minnesota law, first of all. No one who's not supposed to be there can be within 100 feet of a polling place or the entrance to a polling place. So I and the Attorney General and the Commissioner of Public Safety and others really beat the drum on that to make sure that we made an example of this case, and that we told people, anyone seeking to flock to a polling place to help law enforcement, you're not helping, you're hurting, and you're also breaking the law. The president in the first presidential debate, you may remember, sort of lit a fuse when he called on supporters to show up or flock to polling places to help observe and catch fraud or and the like. That too is not legal. Each political party, major political party, is entitled to only one challenger per precinct. It has to be designated in writing by that political party. So you can't have 20 people or 100 people or even 2 people from any one organization descend upon a polling place. So we had to tamp that down as well. In the end, that all worked out. I think because of our efforts, our collective efforts, not just our office, but the governor got involved in that one, the attorney general, law enforcement, sheriffs, and chiefs of police throughout the state, just explaining to people what the rules were and what the law was. And as a result, we had the absence of those incidents. We didn't have people showing up to polling places. We didn't have arguments or conflict or violence at the polling places. And that's a really good thing because it could have been otherwise. It was a very tense election. And like I said, intensity is not a bad thing for elections, but you don't want that to spin out into conflict or violence. And that didn't happen either. So we were very, very pleased about that part of the election as well. But now that we're post-election, and I can't believe I'm still saying this 9 weeks later, but now that we're post-election, we face a different kind of threat. And it's one that we saw play out in horrific fashion on the 6th, a little over a week ago, on Wednesday the 6th. And the assault on the US Capitol was really the culmination of a lot of forces, but one was this tidal wave of disinformation about the 2020 election that we have had to confront and rebut and try to quash. So let me just zoom out and start with the truth. And I think going forward, what all of us have a responsibility to do, either in person or in writing, or in any dimension of our lives, particularly those of us who care about our democracy, which is everyone on this meeting and on this call, is to talk about what the truth is and not let the crazy conspiracy theories and the corrosive fantasies take hold and take root. So here's the truth. The truth is that nationwide, and certainly in Minnesota, this election was honest, fair, secure, and accurate. It was fundamentally all of those things. I'm not saying that there weren't, one-offs of problems or glitches or wrongdoing in very isolated pockets, but in the whole, or on the whole, and generally and fundamentally, it was all of those things, and we have to keep saying that. So I'm really hesitant often to name the conspiracy theories because it just amplifies, it just magnifies, it just gives oxygen to what isn't true. So I'm going to try to avoid that here, but you know what some of them are. Some of them have to do with election equipment. Some of them have to do with characterizations of what the results are. We all know what the truth is, but it's very, very important that particularly from elected leaders, we not allow them to take a pass on this one, because we know what that kind of language can lead to. And we saw what it led to last week. And really, when you think about it, it makes sense. And here I'm going to maybe go against my own rule and talk about some of these words, but I don't think it is any wonder at all, and should not surprise us at all, that when some folks are fed a steady stream of language like stealing and rigging and robbed and illegal election and the like, that some portion, even a small portion, but some portion of folks who are subject to that steady stream are going to take that literally and seriously and take up arms and resort to violence against the alleged perpetrator or perpetrators of all those things. And that's what we saw last Wednesday, egged on, in my judgment, by the President of the United States. And that was shameful, it was embarrassing, and it was really more than anything heartbreaking for all of us as Americans and people who care about democracy. I wish I could say that the fever would break on January 20th. I'm not convinced it will, either in Minnesota or nationally. And all of us have an obligation to fight lies with truth, talk about what the election was, rebut what people say that is not true. And look, I want to make very clear, and Kim, Mayor Norton knows this as a legislator, what I'm not saying and would never say, neither would she, neither would any of you, is we can't have a reasonable discussion, or that reasonable, smart, ethical, honest people can't disagree about the direction of our election system. We can have an argument about this or that reform or law change proposal, some of which I vehemently disagree with. That's okay. I'm not telling people to shut up about their changes that they want in the law or to censor discussion. That's perfectly fine. But what's not okay is, with a wink and a nod, to encourage the conspiracy theorists, those who are fanning the flames, those who are corroding our democracy with falsehoods and lies about what really went on in the election. We can absolutely have a discussion about what's best for our election system and entertain discussions about things that all of us vehemently disagree with. But it is not okay to lie about the election, because it's going to result in continued violence or worse. I, in the Minnesota Senate, testified in mid-December at a hearing, a post-election hearing before the Senate Elections Related Committee. And I said something there that I really regret ended up being true. I said in mid-December at this hearing, I said, I really worry about the language that I'm hearing about there and out there, and I'm particularly worried that someone is going to get killed. I said that. I said, I'm not saying it's going to be in Minnesota, but someone's going to get killed. You keep hearing this steady stream of language mischaracterizing and lying about the election, and people are going to take it, as I say, literally and seriously and resort to violence. And that, in fact, is exactly what has happened. So we owe it to ourselves and to our country to talk about what the truth is, and not to entertain the lies. And in fact, press and call upon elected officials in particular to say what the truth is. And so going forward, that's my hope. And I hope that if we're all here again a year from now, that this fever will have broken and we can all have a constructive discussion, as we normally do in Minnesota and nationwide, about what to do and how best to serve our democracy. So I'm actually, despite what sounds like gloom and doom, I am an optimist. I really am. Kim knows this about me. I'm a long-term optimist about this country, about our democracy, about Minnesota. We have our ups and downs, we have our upheavals, but I think we're going to come out of this okay. Our democracy has been dinged and dented a little bit over the last few years, in my judgment. But I think in the end, we will have emerged, and we are emerging from it in a weird way stronger. And I really do believe that. And so I think the future can be bright again, and will be. And that's in no small part thanks to all of you who have never wavered and have never been fair weather fans when it comes to democracy. And I really appreciate that. So with that, I want to turn it over to you for your, not just questions, but thoughts, answers, ideas, anything you got. Thank you. It's an honor to be with you.
Thank you, Secretary of State Steve Simon. Very much appreciate your thoughts and comments tonight. And I have a series of questions, and some have come in the chat room as well. So we'll try to get to these, and they're kind of far ranging. And I'm going to start with a personal one. I recall carrying a piece of legislation for you that at the time was, you asked me to do something, and I did. And it was about poll books. And no one had heard about a poll book before. Well, as I've been election judge for the last several elections, and the poll book seems to have really made elections so much more secure. And so I wondered if you could just give me, as a naive person who trusted you on the House floor, about something that was very new that we'd not heard of. What is your thought about poll books now that they've become quite commonplace?
Yeah, it is the wave of the future, or maybe just the present. They have really saved a lot of time for a lot of people. And really, a poll book, there's less there than meets the eye. It's just an electronic version of the old roster that you get in the polling place. Some of you still go in and sign your name on a paper roster. It's just an electronic version of that, but it can make changes in real time. It's oftentimes super accurate. It can help flag other indirect problems. Now, it's expensive, but fortunately, the federal government and others have supplied some funds, and the state government in the last few years, to help local governments purchase that equipment. They last for a pretty long time as well. They're pretty small, they're pretty sleek, they're pretty efficient. And I think more and more jurisdictions around Minnesota are using them. So thank you. I do remember that, Kim. You were one of the godparents of that movement, and thank you for carrying that bill. Yeah, it's really caught on. It really has caught on, and elections administrators really love it. It saves time, hassle, not just for elections administrators, by the way, but for voters too.
Yes, and I would say one of the things I saw is how quickly people could get through the voting line, tell you their address. It feels like there's some checks and balances in it as well. But yeah, so it was fun to see those when I started working. Okay, so one of the questions is, and this is interesting, will the requirements like no need for witness signatures on an absentee ballot that you introduced because of the pandemic, what's going to happen now moving ahead in the next election? Is this something that's going to be continued, or will that be voided by the legislature or after?
Yeah, so thanks for that. That gives me an opportunity to go down a little bit of a detour, but it's relevant here. So there were two big changes that came about this election to the rules that were temporary, but they came about via litigation, not via legislative change. We were sued. We get sued a lot, by the way, in case you hadn't noticed. Our office is a litigation magnet, and we get sued by all sides of the spectrum. Right now, I'm fighting my own political party in some litigation. It's DFL party. Sometimes we're in court against the Republican Party or conservative groups. So we take all comers, and look, that's the system. If someone sees something that they think they can make a legal or constitutional or other argument, that's where you go. You go to court. So certainly don't take it personally. But we had some litigation, and we ended up engaging in what's called a consent decree, which is a fancy title for a court-blessed settlement that has to go through a bunch of hoops and hurdles. But basically, the two outcomes were this: just for 2020 only, COVID-19 only, there were two big changes that you may have noted this last time. Number one, the waiver of the witness requirement for almost all, there was one subcategory, but almost all voters who vote absentee, either from home or in person, didn't have to get a witness this time in 2020. And then the second thing was the deadline for getting that ballot back. Our normal rule in Minnesota, pardon me, is that the ballot has to be back by election day. So no matter what, whether it's dropped off in person or by mail, it's got to get there by election day. This time, and this time only in 2020, the rule was amended by the courts, not by me, not unilaterally by me. I can't do that, but by the courts after thorough hearings. The court decreed that this year and this year only in 2020, we'd have a postmark rule. So not get there by election day, but postmark by election day, as long as it gets there a week later. So those were the two. To the question, do I think those will last? Probably not, because that would take legislative action, and I just don't see a consensus there. So my guess is no, we'll snap back to the old rule, the existing rule really in state law, which is it's got to get there by election day, and you will have to have a witness if you vote absentee.
Thank you for that. One of the attendees put a question in the chat, and that is, are you for or against voter ID? And it goes on to say, picture ID is required for many activities far less important than voting.
Yeah, fair question. As Kim remembers, and all of you remember, but we had a front row seat in the legislature. We went through these battles several years ago, where there was a photo ID statute, then a photo ID constitutional amendment in the 2012 election. It lost pretty resoundingly when it went to a statewide vote. And the reason is this, and the questioner is not wrong. No one is to pose the question that way. I understand it. This idea that, hey, with all due respect, we show IDs for everything, to board a plane or buy a beer or sometimes cash a check. So why shouldn't you for something as important as elections? And it has it makes a surface sense and appeal. You're not, whoever the questioner is, you're not wrong to answer it. But what I would say about photo ID in all the proposals I've seen is it's one of those examples of the more you look, the less you like, because that surface argument, though very appealing, in the world of elections doesn't quite hold up. For example, to do any of the things that I just mentioned, you don't need to have what the photo ID requirement makes you have, which is a current ID for your current address. If you go and buy a beer, you can have your Kentucky driver's license, and that's fine. You board a plane, you can have your Nebraska driver's license. If you cash a check in Minnesota and you have your California driver's license, that's just fine. So it's pretty lenient. Not the case with photo ID here. It has to be your current address. And when I was in the legislature with Kim, with Mayor Norton, I remember in my own district, and this is just anecdotal, but I did it multiple times. I would go to a senior assisted care facility, which I often did just as a matter of constituent work. And I would take a little informal survey. I'd say, raise your hand, everybody raise your hand. If you right now, as we're sitting here, have a current photo ID of this place where you now live, not the place you moved from, not the house or apartment you were, but a current one not just a current one, but a current one that says this is your address. Maybe half the room, maybe on a good day. And that, I know that's just anecdotal, but that illustrates the problem. So the questioner is not wrong. I think it's an absolutely common sense thing to ask, but the way it plays out in an election, for it to really work or be internally consistent, it needs to be a current address, not just any old ID that's current, but your current address. And that ends up actually and practically shutting a lot of people out of the process, not just folks at senior assisted living, but others who might not have the proper forms of ID. And I guess here's the analogy I always use about photo ID. Just as every doctor and every nurse every day has to make a decision about whether a proposed cure is worse than the disease, this is the example. We have a vanishingly low rate of voter fraud in Minnesota. I mean, it's only a couple dozen cases every election cycle. We get the information under state law from all of the prosecutors around the state, every single county attorney, all 87 counties. I think in 2018, or maybe I'm confusing it with 2016, the number was like 21 out of millions of people. Now that's 21 too many. I want it to be zero and you want it to be zero. But do we want to create a system where to catch 21 people, we might shut out 21,000 people? I mean, and that's not an exaggeration. So, I get where the questioner is coming from, and I get the surface appeal of all that. It's not a wrong impulse at all, but the way it works in elections would, in my judgment anyway, have the practical effect of shutting out a lot more people than it would catch.
Thank you for that. We have another question from the audience. It says, do you anticipate a movement in Minnesota to have vote from home like Arizona or Colorado? And I'm sure you know what the differences are.
Yeah, I do. That's a great question. There are a number of states now. It used to be 2 or 3. Now it's up to 6 or 7 plus DC, where that's pretty much, it's not the only way, but it's the really only government supported way of mass voting, where every voter automatically gets mailed a ballot. Whether you want it or not, you ordered it or not, if you're an eligible voter, if you're a registered voter, I should say, you will automatically get the ballot mailed to you. You can then, if you want, in those states like Oregon, Washington, Colorado, others, you can, there are circumstances where you can vote in person, but 90+% vote from home. I don't think there will be move in that direction anytime soon. I think our hybrid system in Minnesota has served us well, where if you want to vote in the polling place, you can. If, as an increasing percentage of people want to vote from home, you can do that. As I said, this time it was 58 to 42%. So 58%, a pretty large majority, said thanks, but no thanks to the polling place. I like voting on my couch. I'm not sure, by the way, where we'll, let's just all assume, God willing, right, that we're past the pandemic by 2022. It'll be really interesting to me to see nationwide and in Minnesota where we land. I don't think we're going back to 24%, but I'm not convinced we're going to stay at 58% either. It'll probably be somewhere in between. I think there are some people like me. I love voting in the polling place, but I wanted to lead by example. And so my wife and I decided we're going to vote from home this time. But once COVID lifts, I like going to the polling place on election day just to soak up the atmosphere, say hi to the judges and all the rest. So I'm one of the 58% that's going to go back to the old-fashioned way myself. But no, I don't see a huge call in Minnesota for a one-size-fits-all vote from home, but I do see more and more people over time choosing to adopt that as the way to vote.
Thank you for that. So this one's about the Electoral College. So we're going to switch a little bit. Do you think the Electoral College benefits still warrant its existence?
So I have a nuanced answer to that, and I have very strong opinions on this one. Kim, you may remember this. You just wound me up here. Here's the way I look at it, and I promise I'll answer the question, but I start with this premise. The person with the most votes should win. That's the way we treat every other office under the sun, which is all the more reason why we should treat the most powerful person, not just in the country, but in the world that way as well. And I think it is increasingly difficult and untenable for a democracy as vibrant and large and increasingly diverse as the United States of America, which seeks often to export democracy around the world, increasingly untenable for us to explain to people around the world why once in a while, and maybe not so once in a while, the second place vote getter wins the presidency of the United States. And so there's a way to accomplish that result without getting rid of the Electoral College. And let me just zoom out for a minute again, which is, you may know that the Constitution creates this thing called the Electoral College. It's basically a point system, right? All states get a bunch of points based on population, and those points are what vote for president. And the Constitution is really clear on one thing. The states get to decide how they allocate those votes. There's nothing in the Constitution that says winner take all, meaning if someone wins your state, they get your electoral votes. That's a choice that legislatures make about how to allocate them. So let me give you a couple absurd examples to illustrate the point. If Minnesota wanted to, as dumb as this would be, if Minnesota chose that it is going, if the legislature passed a law saying, we hereby say that going forward, we are going to give all of our electoral votes, our 10 electoral votes, to the tallest candidate, whoever he or she may be. That's a dumb idea, but constitutional, because the framers said, and the Constitution says, here are these points we're calling electoral votes. You states, you decide how to dole them out. Or if we said, we're going to give our electoral votes to the candidate with the most letters in their name. What a stupid idea, but totally constitutional. By the same token, the method that I support is called the National Popular Vote Compact. And all it is this idea that states should on their own decide to allocate their electoral votes on the basis of who wins the national popular vote, not just their state. Now, it so happens 48 states out of 50 have over time made the choice to allocate it on a winner-take-all basis. If you win Minnesota by one vote, you get all 10 electoral votes. Only 2 states, Maine and Nebraska, do it differently, where they allocate it by congressional district. But all the others have chosen it. But it is a choice. It's not something that the framers said you should do. The framers said the opposite. States, you decide. Here are your points. We're going to call them electoral votes. However you want to distribute them, you distribute them. And I and others are calling for states to make the decision. And so far, states adding up to 196 electoral votes have made that choice. The key will be getting past 270. Minnesota is not among those states. I used to carry that bill when I was in the legislature. I still support it now.
Thank you for that. So we're going to switch gears a little bit. This is going to get you onto redistricting.
Okay.
A little bit, but it's more of a personal situation. So this person says, I'm feeling very defeated as far as being represented in the 26, I think it's District 26, which includes my Northeast Rochester neighborhood and the city of Stewartville. Mm-hmm. How does this voting area follow district guidelines such as geographical closeness or demographics? These areas are not close in any way. And in fact, there's even a larger issue than that for representation in Rochester in our Senate and presidential elections, our congressional seats. So can you talk a little bit about that issue and how redistricting, how we think about geographics?
Yeah, well, you and I lived through those redistricting wars after the 2010 census, remember, in 2011 and 2012. And I know the league nationally and in Minnesota has been very active on those issues. Redistricting is really tough. It's a jigsaw puzzle in more ways than one. You have to have equally sized, not geographically, obviously, but equal population districts, roughly. There's a little wiggle room there. And there are all these redistricting principles that the courts say you got to follow. One of them, as the questioner rightly implies, has to do with communities of interest, or the idea that not so much like communities, but you don't want communities that are just, imagine a district that like started in downtown Minneapolis and was like 10 feet wide and went all the way up to Duluth or something like that. I mean, that's a ridiculous example, but you don't want that. You want districts that are as compact as possible. But some of these principles that the courts have set forth are in tension with one another. So the league has been really active nationally, I know, in terms of gerrymandering. And a lot of gerrymandering sometimes focuses on the shape of districts. And people have a lot of fun looking at the weirdly, oddly serpentine, really weird shaped districts that look like they were carved and often are carved for political purposes to help a particular incumbent or give him or her certain precincts or cities or whatever. But sometimes weirdly shaped districts are necessary in order to reach other goals. So if one of the goals is political parity, you don't want districts that are too heavily or overly heavily DFL or Republican. You want more districts that are more competitive. Sometimes that means you got to bust out some weird shapes. Or if you want them to be more diverse, ethnically, racially, or otherwise, sometimes you can't do that with just a square shaped district. You got to jut out and have some odd shapes. And so some of these principles are in tension with one another. And so I can't speak particularly as to how the questioner's, Rochester district ended up with Stewartville, but maybe, I'm speculating, it was for other reasons, that there were other pressures at play. What I support and have supported, it's not going to happen in time for this redistricting cycle. I think we should go the way of Iowa, Michigan, California, Arizona, a growing number of states, which has said, look, the legislature spends an awful lot of time and attention and energy trying to redraw districts. It always ends up in the courts anyway. The dream district, the dream package that the House or the Senate passes never becomes the actual package. Someone will always sue on the left or the right or whatever, and the courts end up redrawing the districts. So let's just skip the middle people and just go to a nonpartisan commission, maybe with some legislative oversight, or maybe an up or down vote from the legislature. That's the one that I used to support, which is the legislature still gets to pass it, but you can't amend it. It's just yay or nay, up or down. And if it's down, you try again and that sort of thing. So that's going to play out now. The House and Senate in Minnesota will have redistricting committees. Whether they'll even agree to anything that they can send to the governor, I don't know. I'm a little skeptical. I think it'll end up in the courts again.
Wow. So we have another question from the audience that's back to elections. So we're going to switch gears again. Keep you on your toes. But the person says, when I dropped off my ballot and 3 other ballots at the absentee voter building in Rochester, there was a sign that said, if you're dropping off more than 1 ballot, you had to go inside and sign off. Was this a Minnesota requirement for dropping off more than 1, or just a Rochester requirement?
That's a great question. It's a Minnesota requirement. So we have a rule in Minnesota that you can drop off as many as 3 other people's ballots, your own and 3 others. You can't drop off a 4th other person's ballot. And when you do that, when you drop off someone's hand deliver, that is to say, someone's ballot, there's a logging requirement, meaning a log must be kept that Jane Doe dropped off the ballots for the following 3 people, or John Doe for the following 2 people, or 1 person. So that's true. That's a Minnesota requirement that's been in law for quite some time, before your time or mine in the legislature, Kim.
That's true. All right, so I'm jumping around here because we have quite a few questions. One that came through text. Third-party candidates often take votes disproportionately from one party. This has led to accusations that a major party has recruited third-party candidates for the purpose of taking votes from a major party. Are accusations like that ever investigated? And if so, by whom?
Yeah, they are investigated by law enforcement, sometimes at the state level, sometimes at the county level, sometimes, I guess, at the city level. You know, that it's a heavy burden of proof, right? And that accusation, by the way, has faced both major political parties, Democrats, Republicans, et cetera, over the years, at least since I've been engaged and involved. Tough to prove, right? You know, a wink and a nod. Boy, it would be great if you ran in district such and such. You know, the people would really love you. Is that recruiting, or is that just planting a seed that, or making a suggestion to someone? So the burden of proof is pretty high, but I know what the questioner is talking about, and there have been those accusations as recently as this last election.
Absolutely. I think we experienced that down here as well. What are you hearing about states that are planning to change laws to redistrict access to voting in future elections? As one example, the Georgia Secretary of State, while defending their election process, stated their absentee voting laws had existed for many years, but because absentee voting had been so popular this year, they would be looking into changing the law to require an excuse to vote absentee in the future.
Yeah, that's a move backwards. That's unfortunate. The overwhelming trend has been the one that Minnesota's a part of, or was when Kim and I were in the legislature, which is to get rid of the excuse. In fact, I don't know of a state that has gone back, that has gotten rid of the requirement for an excuse and then had buyer's remorse about that. But Georgia is poised to do that. That's unfortunate. That is a real step backward for voters. There's no good reason why it's not more secure. It doesn't lend itself to a more accurate election. It's just going to annoy people in this day and age to have to give some sort of excuse like we used to have to in Minnesota. People really like voting this way. I will say it's sort of a tale of 2 cities in Georgia. My colleague in Georgia, I think, on the one hand, what the questioner describes is disappointing, to say the least. On the other hand, he in particular, his name is Brad Raffensperger, deserves a ton of credit for standing strong and standing courageously against what had to have been enormous political pressure from his own political party to do the wrong. Well, I shouldn't. That's not fair. From the president. I don't think it's fair to paint a whole political party. The president of the United States exerted personal pressure in an hour-long phone call on him, as did others of his lieutenants, to, either find votes or find fraud where there was none. And he stood firm and he stood strong. And I think he deserves a lot of credit for that. But am I disappointed in what the questioner describes? Yeah, I don't know of a single state that's gone back to requiring an excuse.
Great, thank you. So somebody asks, they want to make sure that you personally are safe and want to know if you've been getting threats on your life and how you're handling all that.
Yeah, the Star Tribune just yesterday read an article. They interviewed me and Keith Ellison and Paul Gazelka as well, the Senate Republican leader. So it's not just a DFL or Democratic thing. I have never seen, I've been in elected office for 16 years now, 10 in the legislature and now 6 in this job. I have never seen a climate, and I hope you're okay, Kim. I have never seen a climate like this when it comes to public officials. The threats, the intimidation, the level of insults. Look, we who do this, we have thick skin. You get all sorts of people who say nasty, mean things about you, and you're in the wrong business if you can't accept that. So that's fine. That's fair game. You don't like to read it, but that's okay. I mean, I've been called, a communist and a traitor and all the rest, and I'm going to Gitmo and all the rest. That's fine. I barely even registers anymore. But it's quite another thing to venture into other stuff. And for the first time ever, me being in elected office, my wife and my sister were the subject of what I would call online harassment. And I don't just mean bad names or insults. I mean someone, in one case, posing as a reporter, trying to get information about from my wife. Someone who had looked into my wife's business and knew details about it, and sort of in an intimidating fashion was like disclosing these details. Things that kind of creeped her out and creeped my sister out. And so I do worry about that a little bit. I have had to be in close touch with multiple law enforcement agencies over the last few months, particularly the last 2 or 3 weeks, just to make sure that we're okay where we are. And they've done a masterful job of making us feel good and like there's a plan, but you just never know, right, what someone's going to do. And you hope it never comes to that. But no, overall, I feel good. Thank you for asking. Others have had it much worse than me. And I think we're going to ride this out.
I'm glad to hear that. And I'm sorry your wife and children had to be exposed to that. I think one of the other questions is, I think we all know someone who truly believes the election was stolen. How do we fight misinformation to people who rely solely on extremist websites? How do we do a better job of getting facts out to people who are not prone to searching a variety of news sources?
So this is what I was trying to get at in my opening remarks, which is that I don't think, since I assume that none of us on this call fall into that category, I hope so, we're not the best messengers. We just aren't. People are going to get their backs up. They're going to be suspicious. They're going to be maybe even hostile towards any attempt by the likes of us, regardless of our political party. I assume that all of us on this call do not believe the election was rigged, stolen, anyone was robbed, etc. And so we're not always the best messengers, but there are public officials, including elected officials, who they will listen to, which is why it's so crucial and so critical for them to say what the truth is. They can come out on a different side of the policy discussions that we have, whether it's photo ID, whether it's provisional balloting, whether it's any other thing that I might or Kim might really disagree with. And that's okay, but they've got to do right by the country and say, look, the election was fundamentally honest. They can say, well, I've heard about a pocket over here, a pocket over there, but fundamentally and basically speaking, it was honest, it was secure, and it was accurate. It's important because some of these elected officials, they will be listened to by people who hold those views. So we aren't necessarily the best ambassadors. To the extent that we are, I think part of it is just structural. Some people are under the impression that the system is easily hijacked because its power resides in just a few hands. And one thing I always open up with when I'm confronted with someone who has some of these beliefs is just to say, hey, look, I don't know if you know this, but our office, the Office of Secretary of State, and all Secretary of States across the country, we don't touch ballots. I never see them. I never handle them. We never touch them. That happens in Olmsted County or Rochester at the county, city, and township level. Some people are under the mistaken impression that one person in a state, a governor or a secretary of state, has this power to count and tally the ballots. No, we just post and and canvass what 87 different counties canvass. So it's very decentralized. And to the extent you can get people thinking about that, they might not know that. They might have been told, or at least it's been applied to them, that one person in a state can flip a switch and transfer votes or do this kind of thing. Blessedly, that's not the way our system is designed. It's highly decentralized. So a lot of people would have to be in on the plot. Let's put it that way. This is not Ocean's 11, where 11 people knock off the casino, right? This would be more like Ocean's 11,000. You'd have to have so many people would have to be in on the scheme and the plot and the conspiracy that it's not realistic. And so it's just important to get that across as well, to the extent that we're doing the speaking.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to ask one quick question. I know we're out of time here, and then I've got a few closing comments, but can you give maybe a suggestion to the League of Women Voters on what their members could focus on? What part of government should we be looking at to assure Minnesota redistricting yields fair representation and that we continue to have a strong and fair and honest voter system? Well,
I think two come to mind right on the surface. One is the Minnesota Legislature. And I always tell people, and I hope Kim shares this view, but having served there, my view is, and this is such good news for Minnesotans on any issue, legislators are shockingly accessible. Shockingly. I think a lot of people see that big marble building in St. Paul and they imagine to themselves layers and layers of people and security and buffers and all the rest. That's not the way it is. Also, forget the physical space, which these days during COVID is less relevant. My experience as a legislator was that if I got, say, 5 emails or 6 emails on the same subject in a close period of time, not over a month, but over a day or 2 days, I would take notice. I'm not saying I would automatically be putty in their hands and do what they want me to do. They wouldn't necessarily have my vote, but they would have my attention. It does not take an army of thousands to get the attention of a legislator, the attention, not the vote, but the attention. You don't need, if I got 5 emails or 10 voicemails in a 2-3 day period, I'd be like, what is this House File 123 on plumbing regulations or whatever? Like, what is this all about? I'm getting a few of these emails from folks in my district. I'd start asking questions. And so one is the legislature. It does not take an army of thousands. There are not buffers and layers of staff. The legislators are shockingly accessible to people, much more so than most people imagine them to be. So that's number one, get to your legislator. And number two is don't forget about the courts. Sometimes the legislature gets it wrong. Sometimes there aren't the votes there to do the right thing or the best thing. And the courts are oftentimes a resource and a recourse. And the league has been active in that space as well in Minnesota, even in the 2020 election as well. So those are the two that come to mind in terms of shaping the outcomes.
Much. So there's 2 things I want to ask folks before they go. One is there'll be a poll at the bottom of the page, and we ask that you fill out that poll. I don't know where it is, and I don't see it on my screen, but they tell me you can find it. So they'll launch it here in just a second, I think. So it's a very short question they'd like you to do. And the second, I would like you to all join me, virtual hand clap. For our wonderful Secretary of State and my dear friend, Steve Simon. Thank you so much for sharing. So appreciate.
This hour flew by. Thank you. If you want me back, I'll come back. And let me just say one other thing. I know that there isn't always time on a meeting like this, nor is it everyone's style always to submit their own question. So let me give you my direct email at the office. This isn't the Secretary of State general box. There is no gatekeeper, filter, screener. This goes right to me. No one reads this other than me. So here it is. So if you think of something tomorrow, next week, next month, and you say, hey, wait a minute, I had this thought, or I want to give you a piece of my mind. You were full of it that night. And I'm going to tell you why. Here it is. It's steve.simon@state.mn.us. steve.simon@state.mn.us. Shoot me an email with your ideas, your thoughts, your criticism, your pushback, whatever you have. Thank you so much for your involvement in the league, and thanks for having me tonight. And thank you, Mayor Norton, who I really miss as a colleague. She was just one in a million, and is just a wonderful person and public servant.
Wonderful to see you. I'm going to make a few closing comments here, and you can sign off and go give your kids a hug and put them to bed.
Thank you.
So I just want to make the polls up now, and you can do that while I just make a couple comments. As a league, we develop and support positions that empower voters and defend democracy. We provide education to our members and to the public about these positions. Positions such as fair and free elections, We advocate for League of Women voter positions at the state, local, and national level. Members' dollars go to this ongoing work at all levels. If you've asked what you can do to ensure that our democracy remains robust and durable, you can join the League. We've got a place for you. You can find links on our webpage, Facebook, and our email address in the chat box, as well as Secretary of State Simon's email. They typed that in the chat box too, so open that up before you leave and jot it down. This is the first in our series of monthly online educational events. To find out more about the League's positions and the League's 2021 legislative agenda, please join us on our annual program planning meeting, which is held on Saturday, February 6th at 10 a.m. via Zoom. You can find it on the Facebook page. Check out our League of Women Voters website, lwvrochester.org, or our Facebook page for event details. I want to thank you so much for joining us, and have a great evening. Good night.